To start off our next unit, we're going to look at page 7. We're going to be solving percent problems using proportions. This is pretty much going into the next unit doing exactly what we did in the last unit. So for those of you who found proportions to be really, really easy, this should make you feel really good because this is really, really easy. If you struggled with proportions, your next video is going to be on equations, and maybe that might make a little bit more sense to you. However, you're going to have to pick one way or the other to survive and be successful in this unit. At the top of the page, you have two proportions. Part over whole equals percent over 100. This is essentially what you are going to use to set up 99% of the problems involving percents. The other way you can think of it as is over of equals percent over 100. And those are just using keywords is and of to identify the part and the whole. When we read the first problem, we're going to be finding, on this page, we're finding the part out of the proportion. Notice that it tells us that we can round to the nearest hundredth if we need it. Doesn't mean we're going to need it, but if we need it, that's what we need to round to. The first one says 25% of 124 is what? So what I like to do is I like to circle the parts, the part, the whole, the percent, or the is, the of, the percent. I see 25% in our proportion. That's going to tell me that 25 goes over 100. We keep reading. Of 124. Notice that in is over of, 124 is on the bottom. Or you can think of it that 124 is your whole. And then it says is what? Meaning we want to know what the part is. So I'm going to use n for part. We go about it that we're going to cross multiply like we did in the last unit. 100 times n equals 124 times 25. 100 times n is 100n, which equals 124 times 25 is 3100. And n will equal 3100 divided by 100. Therefore, n is going to equal 31. So the answer to our question is 31. The next one, 43% of 230 is what? Well, let's go through the steps again. 43% tells us that 43 is going over 100 in the proportion. 100 is going to be there no matter what. Percents are always out of 100. No matter what the percent is, it's always out of 100, so therefore the percent will always go over 100. Of 230 indicates that 230 is going to go on the bottom. 230 is the whole, or you can think that is over of is going to go on the bottom. Is what? So variable is going to go over 230. We cross multiply, and we get 100 times n equals 230 times 43. 100 times n is 100n, which equals 230 times 43 is 9,890. N is going to equal 9,890 divided by 100 to leave us with n equaling 98.9 or 98.90. Both are correct. The third one. Find 65% of 245. Find 65% of 245. So this tells us that 65% going to go over 100 because percents are out of 200. 245 is your whole, or it's the of, so it goes on the bottom. And in this case, we're looking for the part. It didn't tell us we were finding the part, but that's the only thing that's left for us to find, so that tells us that's where the variable has to go. We cross multiply just like we have been, and we have 100 times n equals 245 times 65. 100n is equal to 15,925 because 245 times 65 is 15,925. We then divide 15,925 by 100 to find out that n is going to equal 159.25. On to the fourth one. What is 12.5% of 180? What is 12.5% of 180? This is an example where students will go, oh, 12.5 is going to be the part. It's going to go over the 180, is going to go over the 80. However, the percent sign is a dead giveaway for what goes over 100. 12.5 has the percent sign, therefore 12.5 can only go over 100. It can go nowhere else. 80 is your whole because it goes with the word of, telling us that we're again looking for the part. Cross multiply like we have been. And we have 100 times n is equal to 80 times 12.5, giving us 100n is equal to 1,000 because 80 times 12.5 is 1,000. And we're going to divide 1,000 by 100 to give us that n is going to equal 10. Now let's try a word problem. In 2001, there were a total of 6,157 million people on Earth. 40% of the people were 19 years older or younger. How many people fall into that age bracket? Okay, so we know we're going to use a proportion because right now, the only way you all know how to solve percent problems is with a proportion. I'm going to identify the percent, 40%. So automatically we know 40% has to go over 100. What 40% represents is it's 40% of the people who are 19 years or younger. Okay? And when we read this, earlier in the problem it says total of 6,157 million people on Earth. There are some extra numbers in this problem, 2001 and 19. We don't need to put those numbers into our proportion. They are there just for informational purposes. The fact that it says a total of 6,157, that indicates that that's going to be our denominator. Where it gives you this million people, that's going to be your units. Now we're looking for the part because what we're looking for is how many people fall into that 40% range. How many people are going to be in that 19 years old or younger? We cross multiply like we normally have been. 100 times n equals 6,157 times 40. 100 times n is 100n. And 6,157 times 40 is 246,280. And we divide the 246,280 by 100 to indicate that there are 2,462.8 million people that are 19 years old or younger. That is that 40% of the total 6,157 million. Now we're going to go about finding the percent. We're still going to use part of our whole equals percent over 100 or is over of equals percent over 100, and we're still going to round to the nearest hundredth if we need to, but this time our variable is going to go in a different spot. The question says, what percent of 250 is 138? What percent of 250 is 138? So when we set up our proportion, the first thing that goes off in your brain or needs to go off is, hey, there's no percent sign. This means the variable must go above the percent sign. We then read of 250 to indicate 250 goes on the bottom, is 138, indicating that 138 is your part. Don't get in the habit of thinking that the smaller number goes on top all the time because that isn't guaranteed to be true. We cross multiply like we normally have been. 250 times n equals 138 times 100, giving us 250. N is equal to 138 times 100 is 13,800. We then divide 13,800 by the 250 to get that n is going to equal 55.2. We don't want to forget our avocados in this case, so that's percent because we are asked what percent. The second one, 52 is what percent of 60? 52 is what percent of 60? Again, no percent sign. Bit of a giveaway that your variable needs to go above 100 because there is no percent sign. 52 is the part, it's the is. Of 60 indicates 60 is going on the bottom. Cross multiply like we have been. 60 times n is equal to 52 times 100. 60n is equal to 52 times 100 is 5,200. We then divide 5,200 by 60. And we get that n is going to be approximately 86.6 repeating, but we were asked to round to the nearest tenth, so that means n is about 86.67, and we don't forget our units. Percent. The last one. What percent is 14 of 15? What percent is 14 of 15? There is no percent sign, therefore our variable is what is going to go over 100. What percent is 14? That tells us 14 is the part, whereas 15 is the whole, because is going to go over the of. We cross multiply as we have been doing. 15 times n equals 14 times 100. 15n is equal to 1,400 because that's what 14 times 100 is. We then take the 1,400 and we divide by 15 to get that n is going to be approximately 93.3 repeated. We were asked to round to the nearest hundredth. Therefore, n is going to be approximately 93.33, don't forget your avocados, percent. Now we're going to find the last piece of information, the whole amount, your total. Once again, we're using part over whole equals percent over 100, or is over of equals percent over 100, and we're going to round to the nearest hundredth if we're needing to. Let's read the first problem. 19 is 75% of what number? 19 is 75% of what number? So we read this and we see 19 is. Well, that tells us that's going to be the part. 75%, it has a percent sign. It must go over 100. Some students will see 75% of and think it has to be the denominator under 19. But the fact that it has a percent sign tells us it must go over 100. And our variable is the of what number? So the variable goes on the bottom. Cross multiply as we have been. 75 times n is equal to 19 times 100. 75 times n is 75n. 19 times 100 is 1900. We then need to divide the 1,900 by 75. And we get that n is approximately 25.3 repeating. We're told to round to the nearest hundredth, so n is approximately 25.33. The second one, 99% of what number is 310? 99% of what number is 310? So first we see 99%. Automatically we know it goes over 100. Even though the word of comes after the percent sign, the fact that it has a percent sign is what tells us it goes over 100. Of what tells us that of is the whole, which is going to be our variable. But if we didn't know that, 310 is after the word is 310. Therefore, 310 has to be the part. We cross multiply as we have been. 99 times n equals 310 times 100. 99n is equal to 31,000. And we then divide 31,000 by 99 to get that n is approximately 313 point repeated 13. Since we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, we get that n is approximately 313.13. The third one. 207 is 46% of what number? 207 is 46% of what number? So when we look at this, we know 207 is, that's your part, therefore it has to go on top. 46 is the percent sign, so it's going to go over 100, and we're looking for the whole amount, the total. So our variable goes under the 207. We cross multiply as we have been. 46 times n is going to equal 207 times 100. And we get 46 times n is 46n. 207 times 100 is 20,700. We then divide the 20,700 by 46 to get that n equals 450. Now let's put this into effect in a word problem. A floor has 90 blue tiles, which is 15% of all tiles on the floor. How many tiles are there on the floor total? Let's read it again and circle the information we know. A tile has 90 blue tiles, which is 15% of all the tiles on the floor. How many tiles are there total? When we set up our proportion, the first number that we can easily place is the 15. It's the percent it's going over 100. What that 15% means is it says 15% of all the tiles, so that means that's going to be the blue tiles. If 15% is the blue tiles, 90 is the blue tiles, that means 90 also has to go on top, and what we're looking for is the total. Cross multiply as we have been. If you were to mess this up, it would be because you put the 90 in the wrong spot, I hope, and not the 15. 15 being the percent, there's only one spot for it no matter what. We do 15 times n, which is 15n. We do 90 times 100, which is 9,000. We then divide 9,000 by 15. And that tells us that n is going to equal 600 tiles are on the floor.